A few years ago, a group of my colleagues and I were traveling to a new area where we were planning on building a new production facility. The location was a bit off the beaten path, and we found ourselves in a rental car traveling down hundreds of miles of farm roads surrounded by corn and soybeans. Eventually, we came upon a small town. Now, when I say small, I mean there was one blinking red light hanging over the only intersection. At this point, all of us were tired of snacking on gas station food, and someone in the car suggested we stop at the small diner on the corner of this one intersection. So, we parked and went in. It was quiet in the diner that day, so the service was great and the food was amazing. But the memory I have most about this meal is the tale the elderly owner told us while we waited for our food. This is that story. So now, let us take a slow walk down the dark, empty roads and find the house behind the corn. The legend begins with the Mueller family, German immigrants who settled in the American Midwest in the late 1800s. Hardworking and determined, they sought a fresh start on the fertile land that promised prosperity. The Muellers were a large family, consisting of Johann Mueller, his wife Greta, and their 4 children, Hans, Marta, Wilhelm, and little Lidra. Johann had arrived in the New World almost a month before the rest of the family. He had secured a plot of land with a small farmhouse and barn that was surrounded on all sides by cornfields. The corn, tall and dense, provided both sustenance and sense of security. The Muellers lived a simple but content life, their days filled with labor of the land and their evenings with the warmth of family. But as the months and then years passed, the land that had once been their blessing turned into something sinister. It was October, and the corn stood taller than ever before, its golden stalks almost impenetrable. That year, something changed. It began with small, inexplicable occurrences, tools disappearing, whispers in the wind that seemed to echo through the corn, shadows moving just beyond the edge of their vision. The family tried to brush off these events, attributing them to the stress of the harvest season, but the occurrences grew more frequent and more menacing. The Mueller family's descent into horror began subtly, almost imperceptibly, like a storm gathering on the horizon. The signs were there, small, unsettling occurrences that could be easily dismissed in the bustle of daily life. But as October wore on and the corn grew taller, casting long, ominous shadows, these occurrences began to take on a more sinister tone. It was a warm October afternoon when the youngest of the Mueller children, 5-year-old Lidra, went missing. She had been playing in the yard, her laughter ringing out across the fields as she chased butterflies along the edge of the cornfield. Greta, busy with household chores, kept a watchful eye on her youngest child through the open kitchen window. The corn, which had grown to an unusual height that year, swayed gently in the breeze, a golden sea just beyond the yard. But when Greta called out for Lidra to come in for supper, the yard was eerily silent. There was no sign of the little girl. Panic set in as Greta ran outside, calling for Lidra, her voice growing more frantic with each unanswered cry. Johann and the older children joined the search, combing through the house, the barn, and finally, the cornfield. The corn, thick and dense, seemed to swallow their shouts, muffling their voices as they pushed through the towering stalks. As the search wore on, the light began to fade, and unsettling stillness blanketed the fields. It was as if the corn itself was hiding something, its rustling leaves whispering secrets just out of reach. Despite their desperate efforts, Lidra was never found. The cornfield yielded no clues, no footprints, no torn fabric, nothing to indicate where the little girl had gone. As if she had simply vanished into the air. The family was left with nothing but the eerie silence of the corn and the growing sense of dread that something terrible had begun. In the days following Lidra's disappearance, the atmosphere in the Mueller household grew tense, the air thick with fear and grief. The children, once lively and full of energy, became withdrawn, their play now shadowed by the absence of their youngest sister. Wilhelm, the second youngest, was particularly affected. At 9 years old, he had been Lidra's constant companion, and her loss weighed heavily on him. A week after Lidra vanished, Wilhelm fell ill with a mysterious fever. It came on suddenly, with no warning. One moment he was helping his father in the barn, the next he was shivering uncontrollably, his skin clammy and pale. Greta tended to him as best she could, using every remedy she knew, but nothing seemed to help. The fever burned through him, leaving him delirious and weak. Wilhelm began to have nightmares, waking in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, his screams echoing through the small house. He spoke of shadowy figures moving through the corn, their eyes glowing in the darkness, and of hearing Lidra's voice calling out to him, begging him to come and play. Greta and Johann tried to comfort him, but Wilhelm insisted that the figures were real, that they came closer each night. On the 7th night of his illness, Wilhelm's fever reached a critical point. He began thrashing in his bed, his eyes wide with terror, as if he were seeing something the rest of the family couldn't. He screamed that the figures were inside the house, that they were coming for him. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the thrashing stopped. Wilhelm lay still, his eyes open but unseeing. Greta's frantic cries and Johann's desperate attempts to revive him were in vain. The boy was dead, his small body limp and lifeless. The fever had taken him, but the haunted look in his eyes suggested something far more evil. Hans, the oldest son, was a strong, stoic boy of 14, accustomed to the hard work of farm life. But the loss of his siblings began to wear on him, the weight of grief and fear pressing down on his young shoulders. He tried to remain strong for his parents, but the events of the past weeks had shaken him deeply. One evening, about a week after Wilhelm's death, Hans was out in the barn, finishing the last of his chores. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard. As he worked, he began to feel uneasy, a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, as if he were being watched. When he turned to look out the open barn door, he saw her, Lidra, standing at the edge of the cornfield, her small figure barely visible in the twilight. She was wearing the same dress she had worn on the day she disappeared, her blonde hair glowing faintly in the fading light. Hans froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He called out to her, but she didn't respond. Instead, she slowly lifted her hand and beckoned him to come closer. Without thinking, Hans dropped the pitchfork he was holding and began to walk toward her, his steps slow and hesitant. As he approached the cornfield, the air grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly. Hans felt a strange compulsion, as if he were being drawn towards his sister, unable to resist her silent plea. But as he stepped into the corn, something changed. Lidra's face, once sweet and innocent, twisted into a grotesque mask of anger and sorrow. Her eyes darkened, and her mouth opened in a silent scream. Hans tried to back away, but the corn closed in around him, the stalks seeming to move on their own. He heard whispers all around him, voices that were not his sister's, urging him to go deeper into the field. Panic gripped him, and he turned to run back to the barn, but the path had disappeared, replaced by an endless sea of corn. The next morning, when Johann went to the barn to find his son, Hans was gone. His tools were left scattered on the ground, and his footprints led into the cornfield, where they abruptly ended. The family searched the fields, calling his name, but there was no trace of him. It was as if the corn had swallowed him whole, just as it had done with Lidra. Marta, the second daughter of the Mueller family, was a quiet, thoughtful girl of 12. She had always been sensitive, often preferring the company of her books to the rough and tumble play of her brothers. The loss of Lidra, Wilhelm, and Hans took a heavy toll on her, the grief pulling her deeper into herself. After Hans disappeared, Marta became obsessed with the idea that the cornfield was cursed. She would spend hours staring out the window, her eyes fixed on the swaying stalks, as if searching for some hidden truth. She began to speak of strange visions, of seeing her brothers and sister walking through the corn at night, their faces pale and ghostly, their eyes filled with sorrow. Marta's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She refused to eat, claiming that the food was poisoned by the same evil that had taken her siblings. She stopped sleeping, staying up all night, muttering to herself about the voices in the corn, the things that whispered to her in the dark. One night, Greta awoke to find Marta standing at the window, staring out at the cornfield, her hands pressed against the glass. Her eyes were wide, and she was whispering something under her breath. When Greta approached her, she could barely make out the words. Marta was pleading with the voices to leave her family alone, to take her instead. Greta tried to pull her daughter away from the window, but Marta resisted, her gaze never leaving the cornfield. When Greta finally succeeded in breaking her daughter's trance, Marta collapsed into her arms, sobbing uncontrollably. She cried out that she couldn't take it anymore, that the voices were too loud, too insistent. The following day, Marta was gone. Greta found her bedroom window open, the curtains fluttering in the morning breeze. Marta's footprints led from the window to the cornfield, where they joined those of her brothers and sister and disappeared among the tall stalks. Greta's cries echoed through the fields, but there was no response, only the rustling of the corn as it swayed in the wind. With the loss of their children, Greta and Johann were consumed by grief and fear. The once vibrant household was now a place of shadows and silence, the joy of family life replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. Greta, once strong and resilient, was now a shell of her former self, her mind teetering on the edge of madness. The cornfield, which had once provided sustenance, now seemed like a living entity, a malevolent force that had taken everything from them. Desperate to break the curse that had claimed their children, Johann decided to burn the cornfield to the ground, hoping to destroy whatever evil lurked within. He gathered kerosene and matches, and one night, as the wind howled through the fields, he set fire to the corn. The flames roared to life, quickly spreading through the dry stalks, lighting up the night sky. But as the fire raged, it seemed to take on a life of its own, moving not away from the house, but toward it. Greta, standing on the porch, watched in horror as the flames drew closer, faster than seemed possible. The fire licked at the edges of the house, the heat intense and unbearable. Suddenly, the flames leaped onto the porch surrounding Greta. She tried to run, but the fire moved with unnatural speed, engulfing her. Her screams pierced the night, echoing across the fields as the flames consumed her. Johann, standing just feet away, was powerless to help. He watched in horror as the fire swirled around his wife, her figure silhouetted against the inferno before she was swallowed by the flames. Then, as quickly as it had started, the fire died out, leaving the house intact but blackened and charred. Alone now, Johann was a broken man. The land that had once been his hope was now his tormentor. The cornfield seemed to mock him, its stalks standing tall and unharmed despite the fire. He heard whispers in the wind, soft, mocking voices that sounded like his children, calling to him from the fields. Johann, driven to the brink of madness, wandered into the cornfield one night, his eyes wild with grief and rage. He shouted his children's names, demanding that they return to him, that they stop hiding in the corn. But the only response was the rustling of the stalks and the whispers that grew louder, more insistent. As he walked deeper into the corn, he began to see shadows moving just beyond his vision. The whispers turned to screams, but they weren't his children's voices mingling with the laughter of unseen entities. The ground beneath him seemed to shift, pulling him further into the field. Now trapped, in the distance he saw them, the father, the mother, and 2 children. He didn't know their names, but he knew their faces. They were the faces he saw that rainy night a little over a week after he had arrived in the area, when the corn wasn't at its highest. A thunderstorm owned the sky above as Johann was standing outside the farmhouse his family had called home, in his hand a large hammer. As he opened the front door methodically, perfectly timed with a loud clap of thunder. Taking his time, he moved through the house like a demon, coming first to the bedroom of the sleeping couple. Without a flinch, he struck both of them in the head, twice with the hammer. From there, he made his way to the second bedroom, where he repeated his heinous actions once more. A few minutes later, in the still pouring rain, Johann dragged the bodies from the house, through the water-soaked grass, and into the cornfield. The mother was the only victim to die inside the house. Out in the cornfield, the father and his 2 children slowly died, face down, drowning in the mud. Johann screamed into the darkness, begging to get his family to return, promising they would leave the farm and never come back. The next morning, Johann's body was found at the edge of the cornfield, his face twisted in terror, his hands clutching at the earth as if he had tried to crawl back to safety. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the sky. He had been the last of the Mueller family to die, leaving behind only the cursed land and the corn that would continue to grow, year after year, feeding on the sorrow in the souls of those who dared to come near. After the deaths of the Mueller family, no one in the nearby towns dared to venture near the land. It was said that the corn grew back every year, even though no one planted it. Farmers desperate for a good harvest would sometimes attempt to gather the corn, but those who did often met with misfortune, illness, accidents, and sometimes death. The land became known as cursed, a place where the spirits of the Mueller family and others who had perished there were trapped in an endless cycle of torment. Over time, the story of the Mueller family faded into legend, but the land itself remained untouched, a dark blot on the otherwise fertile landscape. In the mid-1900s, a family, unaware of the land's dark history, built a house on the property. It was November, and the corn had been harvested, leaving the land seemingly empty and harmless. The man, his wife, and their 2 children settled into their new home, pleased with the rich soil and the promise of a bountiful future. But as October approached the next year, strange things began to happen. The corn, which had not been planted, began to grow back rapidly, taller and denser than before. The family heard whispers in the night and saw figures moving in the shadows. They tried to leave, but found that the paths leading away from the house seemed to twist and turn back on themselves, trapping them within the confines of the corn. By the time November ended, the family had vanished without a trace. When the sun came up on the last November morning, the corn and the house were gone, as if they had never existed. The only things remaining were the grass where the house had stood and the dirt where the corn had been standing. When the old man had finished his story, we had already received our food and eaten every crumb of it. The 4 of us sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, soaking in everything that the old man had just described. Out of nowhere, one of my colleagues asked him if the story was true or just helping us pass the time. The old man stood up from his chair and scribbled something on the back of our bill. He then disappeared into the kitchen. The 4 of us looked at each other before leaning in on the table to see what the man had written. None of us said a word. We dropped our money on the table and never looked back.